No, it's early, but we got to check out that debate series from last week.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Welcome aboard on this Monday evening. It's a holiday week, and we probably will see the show a couple of times over the course of the summer, unless there's some other major presidential debate that I've missed here. Anyway, NBC News had its first series of debates with the major candidates, and I say that in quotes because 20 candidates. I think my guest tonight would question whether or not that defines major, right? So we're going to skip some of the local stuff, even though there's always so much going on, and talk about the politics of the nation, the world, and a little bit of our backyard. Joe Fleming will join us momentarily. Headline here, let's do it one at a time. There were two 10-person debates. Here's the review of the first one last week.
The Democratic candidates for president took the stage in Miami for an NBC News debate. The lineup included 3 senators, 2 current and 2 former members of the House, a former cabinet secretary, a mayor, and a governor. Among the hot topics, the current crisis at the southern border.
Watching that image of Oscar and his daughter Valeria is heartbreaking. It should also piss us all off.
For all the American citizens out there who feel you're falling behind, who feel the American dream's not working for you, the immigrants didn't do that to you. The big corporations did that to you.
Candidates were asked about the state of the economy.
Who is this economy really working for? It's doing great for a thinner and thinner slice at the top.
I live in a low-income black and brown community. I see every single day that this economy is not working for average Americans.
Several candidates weighed in on the current abortion debate. Senator Amy Klobuchar included her fellow females in her response.
There's 3 women up here that have fought pretty hard for a woman's right to choose, so I'll start with that.
The candidates looked for breakout moments to make an impression, a challenge, with no more than 7 to 10 minutes apiece in total speaking time, if that.
The Democrats reserved most of their criticism for President Trump.
I don't think we should conduct foreign policy in our bathrobe at 5 in the morning.
Both debate nights showcase the Democratic Party's diverse field and feature more women on stage than past presidential debates.
Joe, I'll tell you, welcome. Good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you.
As I look back on this, I watched both debates.
Right.
Did you?
Yes.
But I'm thinking, boy, that first debate crew gets screwed by the process, because the second one is what you're likely to remember even if you watched both.
There's no question. The second debate had basically all the heavy hitters and the people who are doing well in the polls right now.
Except for
Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
And that's why I think she stood out in the first debate, because she was the heavy hitter in the first
Stood
debate.
out because they kept coming to her.
There's
but I don't know that she stood out with her. I mean, her presentation is consistent.
Right.
I think that's why she's gaining in the polls. And she's no doubt nipping at Bernie's heels in terms of his base, but it's not like she had some blowout moment,
no, she
right?
didn't gain 15 or 20 points. I mean, she may have picked up a point or 2 or 3, but compared to the others in the field that are at 1%, 2%, you know, she stands out, and that's why I think a lot of questions were going to her the whole night, and she was getting her 2 cents in the whole time, getting her positions known. Now, the very liberal part of the party may really enjoy what she's saying. The more moderates in the party may not like what she's saying. That's going to be part of her problem.
Well, tell me what you thought of that whole crowd. Well, tell me what you think about the whole process, first of all.
I think 20 people in a 2-night debate is really too much. As I just said in the report, you get 7 to 10 minutes. You can't really focus on any one candidate. You just get little snippets of each candidate. You need to have more time in there. You know, 4 years ago, there was 4 Democrats running for president. And those debates were a little more formal, and you had Bernie Sanders stood out in those debates. You had 17 Republicans, but that number started to go down fairly quick. I think we need to see these numbers go down to we dwindle down to 5 or 6 Democrats. Then they'll make a lot more sense. I think people will zero in more when we have less people in the debate.
What is the nature of the political scene in the Democratic Party right now, do you think, that actually brings us 24 candidates, 20 who make the cut? What What's going on?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, I think they see Donald Trump as a weak president right now. They see his poll numbers, his job approval rating in the low 40% range. They feel that they could go on there and make an impact. However, keep in mind, when Barack Obama ran in 2008, I think he had like 2% in the first polls. A lot of these people are hoping to catch fire and move up, like Mayor Pete has so far. He's better known as a result of that. I just think they all feel they have a chance. But I think what's going to happen is the money's going to start to run out fairly soon. If they don't start making inroads in the polls, they're going to be short of money, and that's going to basically kill their campaign.
What is your pollster experience tell you about the public's reaction to a 20-person televised field?
I don't think the public is focusing in on this right now.
Well, we know that, right? I mean, by the nature of the calendar.
Right.
But is there a residual plus or minus that comes along with the bulk of candidates? That they remember how many they were? Do they care?
As it narrows down, no. And again, all these candidates right now are going to be focused on Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, those 4 states. And that's where all the resources are going to be going from now until the beginning of next year.
But does it hurt the party in general in terms of its credibility when there are so many people trying to seek the nomination?
I don't think so. We had 17 Republicans running last time at the very beginning.
And he blew through them all.
And let me ask you a question. In July, did you think that Donald Trump, a year and a half out, was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party or the president? I don't think most people gave him much credibility at that time. These people are saying the same thing. Maybe I can catch fire like Donald Trump did and move up.
Yeah, but these guys don't have the money. They don't have the persona. They don't have the.
And a lot of them
what is the by the way? Have you figured out as a political scientist and pollster how we define that rise of Donald Trump through that Republican primary and what other than agitation with the system and latent anger, and he spoke to us, there's got to be some other researchable thing that caused that.
I believe it was the frustration people had with Washington, D.C. Donald Trump was saying what they wanted to hear. I will go in there and shake things up. I'm tired of what's going on. You've elected Republicans, you've elected Democrats, and you've had no change at all. I will be the change. And again, keep in mind, if you're in a 17-person field, 20% of the vote makes you pretty viable. In a 3-person field, 20% of the vote means you're out of it. So I think Donald Trump appealed to a base of people who were angry, and as times went on and the field got smaller, he was able to expand that base. Simple as that.
But I don't see any repeat come from nowhere dark horse in this Democratic field.
I think there's like 5 or 6 right now towards the top who have the best chance at this point. And again, the thing is, a lot of them are trying to grab that same progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They're dividing that vote up. A lot of the Bernie Sanders vote has basically gone to Warren, to Harris. They're dividing that vote up, so Bernie can't get the traction he had 4 years ago.
All right, let's remind ourselves of debate number 2. Here's a recap of the second one the next night.
A heated exchange between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris over the issue of race was one of the most tense moments of the night.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America then?
No.
Do you agree?
I did not oppose busing in America. What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
When the candidates were not trading barbs against each other, they turned their attention to President Trump.
The American people understand that Trump is a phony, that Trump is a pathological liar and a racist.
We have a president who doesn't believe in the rule of law.
If they make it to the White House, the candidates also vowed to change course on U.S. foreign policy. Pete Buttigieg was asked with which foreign power he would attempt to reset a relationship.
We have no idea which of our most important allies he will have pissed off worse.
President Trump got in a few words of his own after the panel was asked if their health plans would provide coverage for undocumented immigrants. He tweeted all Democrats just raised their hands for giving millions of illegal aliens unlimited health care. How about taking care of American citizens first? That's the end of that race.
Yeah, she took it to him.
Yes.
And he was flat-footed.
He was. I think he did not expect what Senator Harris did to him.
How could he not expect that they're going to come after him? There's an old guard feeling here there's a resentment amongst.
Right. I think he believed they were going to come after, but not in this debate. They were going to wait a little while longer until we got closer when people were more zeroing in. But she started early. She caught him flat-footed. There's no question about that. Joe Biden did not have a good night. How much it hurts him? I'm not sure it's going to hurt him that much. You could have a bad debate and rebound for it. Example, 2012, Barack Obama's first debate when he was up for re-election. He was horrible in that debate.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
It was a real stinker.
It really was.
And he admitted it.
Yes, he did. And after that, the next debate was the vice presidential debate, and Joe Biden stood out. And then Obama came back in the next debate and did very well. So you can get by one bad debate, but they have to make sure Joe Biden is ready for these things in the future. I don't think, right now I've only seen one poll since the debate, and it hasn't affected him that much. A little bit he's down, but not to the point where it's going to kill him.
All right, we'll look at that polling data and some of the reaction to the whole week when we come back. Stay with us. And so here was some reaction to the entire situation post-game.
It all started after the debate when Donald Trump Jr. retweeted a conservative commentator who said that Senator Kamala Harris was not an American black because her black father was from Jamaica and her mother from India. Trump Jr. later deleted his retweet. A spokesman said he had drawn attention to it because he didn't know the senator's background. But Trump Jr. deleted it once he saw that folks were misconstruing the intent of his tweet.
I was born black, I will die black.
Harris has been asked to address her identity long before the debate.
This is the same thing they did to Barack.
And since day one of her campaign, Harris has been clear. How do you describe yourself?
How do I describe myself? I describe myself as a proud American. That's how I describe myself.
Over the weekend, fellow opponents came to her defense. Senator Cory Booker said Harris, quote, doesn't have blank to prove. Senator Elizabeth Warren called the attacks racist and ugly. And former Vice President Joe Biden said the same forces of hatred rooted in birtherism that questioned Barack Obama's American citizenship and even his racial identity are now being used against Senator Kamala Harris. It's disgusting.
I never, ever oppose voluntary busing.
But Biden is still facing criticism for his opposition to a federal role in school busing and his own recent comments about past work with segregationist senators.
Whoever the next president is going to be really needs to be someone who can all talk openly and honestly about race with vulnerability, because none of us are perfect. I'm not sure if Vice President Biden is up to that task.
It's ageism.
Yes.
But he either was just ill-prepared or he is a half step slow. I'm not sure which.
Well, if you remember, Joe Biden's other two campaigns for president years ago were disasters. He did very poor, never got the campaign going, never did well. They're going to make sure in this campaign that he is well prepared. It sounds like he was not ready for the stand. And if you're the candidate, you're going to know what the negatives you have about yourself and be ready to answer those questions. His people have to really do a better job prepping for these debates.
But is it a question of, guy's been through the ringer?
Yes, he has. And however, he does appeal. Right now, he's the front runner with about a third of the vote. He appeals to a lot of Democrats, and he appeals to a lot of the moderate Democrats. And that's going to be key in this election. Not so much in the primary, but in the general election.
Well, the politics of this debate were really fascinating. You know, I think it's pretty clear to this audience, I am no Donald Trump fan. Yet the entire time I was wincing. You're just wincing over the programmatical policy promises that are being made, this false notion that college is going to end up free, the debt relief situation. I was actually playing golf with a guy this weekend who just came up to me and said, so let me see if I understand this correctly. Bernie Sanders and a couple of other guys want to wipe out an entire industry known as insurance. Practical people who may not want Donald Trump as their president look at this stuff and think, wait a second, why in God's name are they talking about?
That's what I'm saying. If the Democrats are not careful and they put somebody up way to the left, you know, the Bernie Sanders type.
It's a guaranteed re-election.
Exactly. I mean, we saw, when I was on your show last time, right after the State of the Union, I said, Donald Trump gave his whole campaign right there, socialism. And they're doing it right now. They're going to brand the Democrats as socialists and say you can't elect them because they're going to take away all your freedoms. And you got to vote for Donald Trump. And what people are going to say, well, I don't like Trump, but I don't want to lose these things.
But here is the thing that's really strange about modern America right now. There's almost half the population number of people who do believe the government should be giving them everything they need.
It is higher than it's been in the past. There's no question about that.
Right, so it's a weird space. The reasonable middle of America seems to be lonelier and lonelier.
Right, but as we say in elections, it's not the general population, it's the people who vote. And a lot of people who vote are the ones who still think there's too much government. And that's what's going to help Donald Trump. If they think the Democrats are going to go too far one way, giving too much government.
You think there's you think there'll be a motivated 2020 vote more on the, and I say conservative, and he's such a phony baloney. His own politics aren't textbook conservative in any way, shape, or form. I mean, this immigration thing has always been kind of a flyer they threw against the wall, hope it stuck, and now he's committed to it because he's branded for it, right?
Yep.
You've seen that happen before, where politicians nationally and locally just, kind of go,
which
pick
way
a brand, and then all of a sudden the brand catches, or their idea catches, it becomes a brand, and they have to stick to it. They have no real conviction for it.
And he keeps, every time he's going to do something with immigration, you notice he backs off. Like he's going to arrest all the illegals. Then we're going to hold off on that. I'm going to close the border. We're going to hold off on that. It motivates his base, and then he pulls back a lot.
Going back to Biden for a second, there's a headline in the New Yorker, his son is really kind of letting it all come out. He's really vetting. I'm talking about Beau. Hunter. Beau. He lost Beau. Hunter Biden reportedly has had trouble with alcohol and drugs. His investments are somewhat suspect. Does a sibling or a child an adult child have an impact on a candidate's race?
I don't think it's going to have a great impact. I think it might be a little factor, but I think a lot of this is going to come down to who the candidates are in the end. Joe Biden is going to be there based on Joe Biden. If Joe Biden keeps performing like he has been in the first debate, he's going to have a lot of problems. If he gets his act together, he may be able to hold on to the front runner status. But again, there's a long way to go. It's way too early to really say this one's going to be the nominee or this one can't win at all. There's just too much time. There's going to be a lot of things happening between now and when the primaries start on February 3rd with the Iowa caucus.
And even if there was a really good number, and I guess there was a pretty good number for NBC's coverage last week, it doesn't retain. It's a different kind of good number because it's a summer 2019 number.
The next debate is July 30th and 31st. After that, ABC has September 12th and 13th. That one, you're back almost in fall, more people might be focusing in on that. But I think right now, it's just so early, people are not zeroing in at all. And the thing is, it comes down to basically Iowa and New Hampshire. If you do very poorly in Iowa and New Hampshire, your campaign's over.
What do you think is happening with the president and this North Korea? We will have some expertise tomorrow. Mark Janess from the Naval War College will come here to talk about North Korea. This walk across the line for the president. Again, whatever showbiz he can come up with, he comes up with. I am sure there are establishment, military, and international expertise around this country that are aghast at what just happened there. Does that help him?
It depends if anything comes out of it. Right now,
obviously
it's
he does everything to see if it helps him.
Right. And if it helps him, and if he can get some negotiations going, then it would probably help.
Negotiations today reportedly are to keep the current status of nuclear potential and missile potential intact.
And he'll try to spin that as, look what I've done. I've held them. I didn't let them go any farther. He's going to try to spin it every way he can. Could you imagine if a Democrat did that to North Korea? When Obama opened up relations with Cuba, all the Republicans were all over it.
Weak, right?
Yeah. But now Trump steps into North Korea, and that's okay.
And crickets from the Republicans on this.
Right. Exactly.
They must be going nuts privately.
I would think they're having some problems figuring out this president.
But how does America react to that?
Well, again, do they think it's just Donald Trump doing a photo op, or do they think there's going to be some change as a result of this? Again, it's early. If nothing comes out of it, it's just nothing more than a photo op.
Are enough Americans informed enough about North Korea's status and relationship, other than to know that they're bad and they threaten us a lot? Other than that, what acumen do the American public have?
I don't think they do. I think you hit it right on the nose. That's what they see in North Korea.
So it's not a pollable liability. It might be a pollable plus.
Right. I mean, they may try, the Democrat, depending who the Democratic nominee is, they may try making the issue out of his foreign policy. That, he's more friendly with the Putins and the North Koreans than he is with our allies.
He laughs in front of Putin about Russian intervention. And not a word from the Republicans at all.
Nope.
In the old days, that in and of itself would have been
But
impeachable.
keep in mind, if you're a Republican, you want to be careful because you're afraid that someone might run against you in the Republican primary and beat you with all the Donald Trump supporters. So you have to be careful there if you're on a Republican state.
Was there ever a time in America that candidates for high office actually just thought about the right thing for America versus what the polling reaction would be to everything they did?
Yeah,
Was there a time?
I think back Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan, that time frame, they tended to get along well. They would meet afterwards. They would argue, Democrat versus Republican, but they would get some things done. I think that
without worrying about polling down.
I think polling, back in the early '70s, wasn't as strong as it is now. Now you're getting polls every day. Back then you might see a poll once every couple months. You're seeing it totally different now. And the candidates, they're polling every little thing in their district because they have the resources
When
for
we
it.
come back, we'll peek at a couple of the polls. Stay with us. All right, so there it is. How deep does this crew go? How deep does this thing really go? I mean, what is a number you can move from? Better O'Rourke looks useless.
Now there's a good example. He started off really strong and he just faded out. He was not strong in the debate at all. I think he was a loser in the debate. I mean, he's basically fading as this campaign goes on. He's not ready for the big league at this point, it looks like. But again, there was one poll by Morning Consult that was done immediately after the debate on the 27th and 28th, and Biden was at 33%. He was down about 4 or 5% from the last poll. Sanders was at 19%, the same. Warren was down 1%. Harris was up by about 5 or 6%. So she did get a bump from it. But again, this is just one poll. There's going to be other polls coming out in the next few days. That'll give us a better idea if Joe Biden got hurt in this debate and how much did Harris go up. Remember, she was only running in single digits before this debate. So we're not talking about moving huge numbers at this point. We're talking about her going up 4 or 5 points. There's still an awful long way to go to move up to the top tier.
Democratic brass move on these guys and say, hey, look, clear the deck, or is it just let the process play itself out?
I think those days are done. I think the process is going to play itself out. As I said, as you get closer to Iowa and New Hampshire, some of these people are going to run out of money. They're not going to have the money. They're not going to have the resources to keep on going. And as a result of it, they'll start dropping out. There'll probably maybe a dozen left in Iowa. After Iowa, I think we'll see a couple dropping out. New Hampshire's the week after. We'll see more dropping out.
Does your gut tell you anything about who survives this on the opposition
I would say
side?
right now, my gut would say Senator Biden, Vice President Biden, Sanders, Warren, Harris, Mayor Pete. Those are your top 5. I would expect them to go through Iowa and New Hampshire into South Carolina. After that, there could be 1 or 2 others that moves up.
It is a long way.
It's a very long way, and it's way early.
Which means a lot of visits between now and then from you.
No problem.
Thanks, Joe.
My
Appreciate
pleasure.
it. Final word when we come back. So tomorrow we will take a look at some of these nuances and not so nuances with North Korea. That the president stepped over the DMZ line and took 20 steps is historic. We can't tend to know the reasons why, but what are the ramifications? That's more important. So Mark Janess from Naval War College will be here to talk about it with me tomorrow night. You have a great night. See you on the radio at 3 until 6 on WPRO. Enjoy this holiday week.